the Masculinity Unmasked podcast with hosts Max Wilson and Greg Styan.
And welcome everyone to Masculinity Unmasked, the fortnightly conversation that delves deep into what it means to be a man in the 21st century. So the topic of today's discussion is building confidence in high pressure careers. So we're looking specifically at imposter syndrome. And today, as always, I'm joined by my co-host and fellow coach, Greg Styan. And we're very lucky to have with us as well a very special guest, Massimo Roselli, who is an imposter syndrome and trauma-informed coach. So, very excited about this, Massimo. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Do you want to start briefly by just sharing a little bit about your work and how you got into it?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you guys for having me here. It's a great opportunity for me to talk about a subject that's very close to my heart, which is imposter syndrome. So my journey here has been shaped by a series of life transitions and challenges that have profoundly influenced both my personal growth and the work I do now in my private coaching practice. So alongside my career coaching job with a global organization, I have my private coaching practice where I work mostly with senior professionals on a deeper level to address imposter syndrome, self-doubt, and those survival patterns that maybe hold them back. And my goal is to help them create lives and careers where they can thrive as their most confident and authentic selves.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing that, your journey. I'm sure we'll delve into that as we go through. I know that Greg has a really interesting story that he's going to share about imposter syndrome. Just before we come to that, I think it's really good to sort of set the foundations and actually set out, Massimo, if that's okay, what actually is imposter syndrome. And I've heard some people challenge the use of the word syndrome as well. So I'd be really interested to get your take on it.
Sure. So to simplify it, imposter syndrome is the secret fear of others finding out we're not good enough or a fraud, despite all the external world information, evidence that we are doing well, that we're more than capable.
Okay.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
that's great. Like I said, guys, I've got a really good example, and I'm quite happy to be honest about this. I was coached myself in my mid-20s. I went through a few issues in my own life, and a lot of it stemmed from imposter syndrome. Trying to be someone else, if that makes sense. I got thrown in the deep end from being a school teacher, a head of department, to being a governor for a Russian billionaire, and it was beyond crazy. But obviously, to adapt to the craziness, I tried to act as someone who wasn't naturally me, if that makes sense. And I didn't like the person that looked back at me in the mirror. And I lost most of my friends. Lots of my friends from home I lost during this period. I lost a fiance as well. Like in my early life, if that makes sense. But I did learn from it. And interestingly, when I was getting coached, I remember him real clearly telling me that nearly 70% of people experience imposter syndrome. And he'd gone to tell me that actually there's so many famous examples. I remember him openly telling me about even Albert Einstein feeling like a fraud, feeling like he got lucky with how he impacted on the world, and Tom Hanks, in Michelle Obama, as people spoke openly about it as well. Do you have any other good examples, Massimo, or any real great sort of tips for someone in that situation? And I can, maybe I can resonate with the message that I was given.
Yeah, well, if we're talking about famous people, then another example, another name that comes to mind is Meryl Streep. Meryl Streep actually shared her struggles with imposter syndrome in one of our latest interviews. There are many tips. Unfortunately, what's becoming really trendy these days is that if you run imposter syndrome, or if you have imposter syndrome, which is probably the most common language, which is not very accurate, but if you struggle or if you have imposter syndrome, you have to cope with it. And that's where there's a lot of noise, particularly on the socials, about what you can do to cope with imposter syndrome. So it was interesting also for me to hear that in order for you to succeed, you had to play a part, or you felt you had to play a part, which is actually what happens very often because, again, to go back to another definition of imposter syndrome, it's really a fear-based response, deeply stored in the body.
That's fascinating. That sort of authenticity piece to it, because we are putting on a front and we're having to do things that we wouldn't necessarily otherwise do in certain spaces to perform. And the fact that you're saying it comes from fear. So I think delving into that and looking at some of the causes might be interesting. I'm just the word syndrome is coming up for me a lot, and I'm just wondering, is that the right terminology, or is phenomenon sort of more accurate in your experience?
So it started as the imposter phenomenon. So this was the very first definition that two American psychologists came up with back in the late 70s. More recently, it's more popularly known as imposter syndrome. Whether or not, so just to clarify, because I know that for some people, the definition itself has become sort of a label, which can help. It's important to mention that it's not a syndrome. It's not recognized as a syndrome by the British Psychological Society, but it feels very real and can lead to fatigue, brain fog, inability to concentrate, and other health issues, including anxiety, clinical depression, and burnout. This is why it's known as a syndrome, because it feels real, and if it's left unchecked, unfortunately, it can be very detrimental to your overall well-being.
Yeah. I mean, that's really serious, isn't it? Burnout and all of that. I'm just thinking, as you say that, what are the sort of primary causes of this then, Massimo? Because I'm sure all of us in this room can relate to it. And you said, Greg, earlier, 70% at least people experience it. So what's actually causing this?
Yeah, well, let me tell you, first of all, that according to the latest research, we are talking about 83-84% of people around the world.
Okay. It's even higher.
Just to give you some fresh data.
Wow.
There are many reasons why we may end up running imposter syndrome. And this is something that goes back to the very first definition of imposter syndrome, which came up also as a result of different factors, including imposter syndrome or the imposter phenomenon, as you said. And these factors may include early childhood experiences, culture, gender stereotypes, attribution style. These are just some of the factors that may contribute to imposter syndrome. And even if you think about how aware these days we are about trauma and how trauma can impact our lives, there is a direct link between imposter syndrome and trauma. Very often, due to a traumatic event, you can develop imposter syndrome. So there are many reasons why we can have this experience. The most important thing is to understand what we can do to better cope with it, and ultimately to eradicate it if we are prepared to do some deep work.
Yeah, of course. Massimo, I've got a really good question for you, actually. Related very much to the sort of coaching that me and Max do. So, the majority of the guys that I work with are in high pressure roles, and I was that guy as well. And interestingly, thinking back to when I went through this problem, and I didn't like the character I was, the coach who helped me, he tried to help me establish the roots of the problem, the deep roots. And he thought that my imposter syndrome come from perfectionism when I was an athlete, when I was, trying to be a professional athlete. And I remember always having a motto from Vince Lombardi, perfection is not attainable, but if we chase perfection, we can catch excellence. But we had a guy in last week called Dave. He was an athlete. And he said very much that he took some of his mottos, some of these strategies that you use an athlete to put into everyday life. And that's something that I did, especially when I was doing those high pressure roles. But it was interesting to think that the coach thought that's what was the biggest effect or the biggest driver towards me having imposter syndrome. Would you agree with that? Or is there any other sort of similar sort of like drivers for guys that affect this?
You have raised such a great point, particularly when it comes to men dealing or trying to cope with imposter syndrome. When we talk about imposter syndrome, we talk about the 4 Ps of imposter syndrome, and you mentioned one of those, which is perfectionism. And this is based on the latest research. This is one of the most common survival coping mechanisms, particularly for men. We also have other coping mechanisms, and I'm using the word survival because imposter syndrome is all about safety. So if you don't feel safe, if you feel threatened, that's when you may either self-sabotage or adopt some of these coping strategies, including perfectionism. Particularly for men, according to plenty of research out there, the most popular survival coping mechanisms in the context of imposter syndrome would be perfectionism and project paralysis, which means that if I struggle with project paralysis, I tend to ignore an important goal until the deadline forces me to take action. And I use the
Yeah.
fear-based adrenaline to push on through and get it done.
Interesting.
Interesting. So you've
And
got
then the other 2 Ps are people pleasing and procrastination. So these are the 4 Ps of imposter syndrome. It's all about safety. And unfortunately, it's coaching is very helpful, but it's not enough, because if you really want to eradicate imposter syndrome, you have to do some work that goes beyond mindset. So the tips that you have been given are great, and mindset work is brilliant. But if you really want to completely eradicate imposter syndrome from your body's nervous system, that's when
Yeah.
you might want to combine coaching with mentoring and body-based work.
Interesting. So that's sort of
Excellent.
working
Excellent.
in tandem with other modalities there. I'm really interested looking at it through that gendered lens then, Massimo, because as you were talking there, I was thinking as well, from the sort of man box culture side of things, coming from this wounded masculine place that we all start out, where we're told, from young age to mute up, suppress our emotions and not talk about how we're feeling, compare and police each other, and whether that may have an impact here as well when it comes to imposter syndrome. Because if guys aren't speaking to each other and saying how they're really feeling and what's really going on, it's inevitable that we're gonna start comparing and almost feeling like an outsider in that space, from where I sit. Is that right?
Absolutely. And this is also why, in the context of imposter syndrome, men also, due to culture and how they have been brought up, men would often push through fear, risking mental health issues, while women tend to hold back and play smaller. And this also is the reason why, particularly when it comes to imposter syndrome, uh, perfectionism is one, as we said, is one of the most common survival mechanisms for men. And also, there's an element of overcompensation with risk aversion, particularly if you think about successful male leaders, because you have this secret fear of being found out as not being good enough, because you think or you feel that they made a mistake hiring you. On an unconscious level, your biological makeup means that you're more likely to pick the fight. But despite the hard work of the fight response, you also want to feel safe. As I said earlier, imposter syndrome is all about safety. The whole of imposter syndrome is about you needing to feel safe and that you belong. So to avoid being seen as a hiring mistake, men who experience severe imposter syndrome may opt for safe choices, bypassing innovative, diverse ideas. And as you can imagine, this is not just an issue on an individual level. This can be, and this is a big issue on an organizational level. So I'm particularly thinking about
Yeah.
those men in leadership role who are struggling both individually and collectively within the business.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean,
Very.
we sort of touched on already some ways to begin to address sort of the root cause of that, through those methods that you've discussed, and also working in tandem with the coaching. But I'm just thinking on an individual level for our listeners, what they can start to do going away from here to begin to help themselves, whether that's through sort of a self-awareness piece or whether that's through doing some of that deeper work.
Self-awareness is definitely a good starting point. What I would say to our listeners, you can start with self-awareness just to have an understanding of what your default patterns are and how they show up, whether it's at work or in other areas of your life. Mindset work in this case can be another helpful step, particularly because at this stage the goal is to be an observer of whatever thoughts and whatever feeling you're having as a result of those thoughts. So that's where you might want to incorporate mindfulness techniques, which are backed up by neuroscience. There's a lot of research around belly breathing so that you can reset your body's nervous system response. And once your nervous system is back to a place of homeostasis, where you feel calmer, you feel a bit more grounded, that's when you can choose a more empowering thought. So for our listeners to start tackling their imposter syndrome experience, I would say press the pause button. The quickest way for you to rewire your body is through conscious breathing, and then once you have done that, the next step is to start rewiring your brain by choosing more empowering thoughts. This could be an initial starting point, which can help you, if done little and often with practice. This can help you rewire your body and your brain, and this is what we want to do. We want to create a new body memory and a new brain memory, so that we have less and less of this experience, which is all about fear.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Fantastic answer. Yeah, fantastic. I have another question for you. So when I went through this issue myself, in my mid-20s, one thing I definitely did was take it home with me, if that makes sense. It wasn't just in the office or in the workplace. It impacted me. This character that I like a safety mechanism, if that makes sense, that I went into to protect myself possibly because I felt vulnerable, I took home. And it made me think that openly, when me and Max work with these guys or our clients, we're talking a lot about work-life balance, and you're talking there about breathing, which is great. Meditation, I guess, as well. Are there any real quick tips, anything that would be any good reads, any good places that you could send our listeners?
Sure. Another tip would be writing down three things that you did well during the day. Just make sure that these three things are phrased in a positive way. They are about you, and most importantly, feel them, because you don't just want to work with your brain, you also want to work with your body. And if you attach an emotion to three things that you did well, they don't have to be groundbreaking, three things that you accomplished during the day, if you attach a strong positive emotion to those three things, that's when you're going to create a body memory, which will also help you create a new brain memory in the context of imposter syndrome. And this is, again, something that I would encourage you to do little and often as you go throughout your week, so that it becomes sort of a practice for you. There's a great book that I would highly recommend. I'm actually training with Claire Josa. Claire Josa is the UK's leading authority in the context of imposter syndrome. The book is Ditching Imposter Syndrome. There are loads of tools, exercises, and one of the reasons why I wanted to highlight this book, there are many other resources out there, but this book in particular changed my life, because I also struggled with imposter syndrome to the point that, just to go back to your point, Greg, I ruined quite a few relationships. I also ended up developing a few addictions.
Yeah,
This
I did
book
too.
is backed up by plenty of research, so I'm pretty sure that it will be really valuable to our listeners.
Yeah,
That's
that
so
was excellent. That was
helpful,
excellent. Yeah.
Massimo. The training log idea, the evidence log, that's something that I've certainly seen beneficial for myself when I've been in that space of receiving feedback. And it just made me think as well, just when we receive feedback, especially we have that perfectionistic drive that you were talking about earlier, Greg, it's really easy to go into that imposter syndrome zone. So almost like reframing that feedback as a learning opportunity, a tool to develop. And I think it was Ken Blanchard from the 1 Minute Manager says feedback is the breakfast of champions. I think that's so true, is learning how to receive that. And the other point you mentioned around sort of the story, the negative narrative we tell ourselves, I've certainly been in that space myself. When I was lecturing, I had a student once that was asking so many questions, and I was thinking in my head, oh, I must be a bad teacher. I must not know my stuff. And that was the sort of rhetoric that was going round. And right at the end of my sessions, they came up to me and said, thank you so much for answering all my questions. Just, I'm incredibly anxious, and I found that really, really supportive, because you clearly knew what you were talking about, and you were able to support me. Now, I had delivered myself a message, a story about how rubbish I was in that whole experience, and actually quite the opposite was true. So really challenging the narrative, the truth behind the story, I think, is something from my own experience that has been helpful for me. Greg, any other final tips before we wrap up from your own experience?
No, there was just one thing that really cried out to me there is we're all talking about it, experiences that we've had ourselves. And Massimo, when you talked about that, I was literally ticking off boxes thinking that was me. I had the habits, I ruined relationships, all because of this role I had. It's just really interesting. Is that, because obviously knowing this is a bit of a niche subject, is that what inspired you to get into this subject? This, you because of you had experiences yourself?
That was definitely one of the reasons why I wanted to do some more research about this topic.
Yeah, of course.
And then when I started working with professionals from a wide range of backgrounds, I started noticing quite a few patterns in terms of thoughts, emotions, behaviors, which reminded me of my own patterns. And that's where I came across this thing stored in the body that has got nothing to do with logic, which many people know as imposter syndrome, and this is really what has influenced my journey, to the point that today my specialism is working with people who severely struggle with imposter syndrome.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like you're doing some amazing work there, Massimo. Thank you so much. Well, do either of you have any final thoughts for our listeners before we wrap up today?
No, it's absolutely fascinating. And I just want to say thanks for your time, Massimo. He's got a fantastic LinkedIn handle to go and check out. And he's obviously doing some really great work as well. So well done, guys. I thought that was a fantastic chat, and it's amazing to think that we all had similarities there as well, that we've all faced it ourselves.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Greg.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you again for this opportunity. I think it's really important to talk about this topic, particularly with men and for men, because unfortunately there is still this tendency in terms of not sharing how we feel about it, and we still think, many people still think that imposter syndrome is something that only affects women, whereas there are many men in the UK and around the world struggling with imposter syndrome, to the point that, as we said, their well-being is jeopardized.
Yeah. So
Excellent.
true. So true. And if our listeners want to find you, Massimo, what's the best way to get in contact?
The best way at the moment is my LinkedIn profile. I have a strong LinkedIn presence, so you can just drop me a message if you want to know more about this issue.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Greg, and thank you very much, Massimo, for getting stuck into this conversation.
Thanks, guys.
As always, it's great to chat and really interesting to hear everyone's insights on this. And thanks everyone for listening. Hopefully you've all found the conversation this evening useful. If you do resonate with any of the topics that we've discussed today, or if you've got any ideas or things you want us to chat about in the future, then please do get in contact. In our next conversation, we're going to be having a look at fear and how to move past it. But I hope everyone has a good week ahead. Thank you very much.